Hello, welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst, and yeah, this is our new studio, our home studio that we built in about a week. Thanks to you guys. Thanks to our patrons on Patreon who have been extra patient with us because our show has come a couple of days late due to some technical glitches. I'm not the tech wizard here. I've been working with really smart people very far away and helping us set this up, like Dorsey, our producer. And you know, we're trying as hard as we can. But extra thanks to the folks who've delivered our items because they are taking a great risk right now. We know that Amazon workers are not being properly equipped to protect themselves and to protect others. So thank you so much. Thank you to the cable guy who came and fixed our cable, our broadband. It didn't work. So that delayed our show a little bit. He came on the outside and he helped us set it all up between, you know, we had a window dividing us. That was a new process. And just thank you to everybody else who's out there on the front lines. This is an extraordinary time. And you know, we as a community, I think, are a little bit more aware of what it means to be a worker in America, but especially right now when so many provisions are not in place to support and protect our workers, you know, it makes this fight so much more worth it. And it's why I'm excited to have David Doel on today, who is the host of Rational National. He is one of our leaders in left independent media, and we talk about the importance of independent media right now at this moment when so many people are looking for information, they're looking for important analysis and thoughtful analysis, and it's extremely important because so many of us in independent media are funded off of, you know, crowdsourced small dollar donations and, you know, contributions. So David Doel is on the show, and then David Daley is on the show who's going to talk a little bit about gerrymandering. Yeah, we have elections. Do you forget about that? We have elections coming up, not just half of the primaries that are set to happen in the next, you know, several months, many of which have been delayed, but we also have a general election. So David Daley talks a little bit about his new book and what's happening behind the scenes, what the Republicans are doing, what big money is doing to gerrymander and rig the elections coming up. So stick around. We have a great show. And next up, I talk about Andrew Cuomo. He's not all that Jezebel writers say he is. We have to remember his record and why Andrew Cuomo is not our friend. It's in times of crisis a leader is tested. It's in moments like these. Throughout history, leaders have risen to the occasion, put forward bold ideas like the New Deal. History reflects well on our leaders who have stood up to corruption and who have declared that the buck stopped at them. But history, recent history especially, also just depicts people in positions of leadership using their platform for personal political ambitions during times of crisis. Now, don't get me wrong. Being a responsive governor and an ambitious governor do not have to be mutually exclusive. But when there is a leadership vacuum, especially in New York, the media capital of the world, and now the center of the COVID crisis in the United States, when there is a leadership vacuum, and in New York, the president's home, where you also have politics at its finest, there is a prime opportunity for a strong, articulate, calming force to declare what's real and what's not, to declare what needs to be done, to just show up and admit that shit's bad, to appear to take charge, and to point at the foe of most New Yorkers, President Donald Trump. Now, let's be real. New Yorkers, we love a good fight. We love the brutal honesty. We love the spicy political bickering between politicians and sometimes the press. We love those saucy New York Post headlines, even if we're ashamed to admit it. But if there's one thing we have learned in the last few years, not all New Yorkers love Governor Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo can appear great when it's all about him, when he is unchallenged by someone who exposes his flaws, when he doesn't have to navigate and work with political factions, when he doesn't have to pass a budget or respond to activists and donors at the same time. Now, someone who actively sought a challenger to Andrew Cuomo in 2018 and who campaigned, spoke out, and organized for the brilliant Cynthia Nixon, I even found myself charmed and a little bit transfixed by Governor Cuomo during the first days of his press conferences. But I always like a little bit of a charming, take-charge Italian guy, especially one who has a good relationship with his mom. But admittedly, I was even slightly swayed by the performance of New Jersey Hurricane Sandy hero Chris Christie during the GOP debates. Did you see the Republican fools that he was running against? Anybody would look good against them who took charge. But he was, of course, later tanked by his own corruption Bridgegate scandal. And who, of course, can forget Giuliani during 9/11? It's not like we didn't know then what we know now. All you have to do is pick up any of New York journalist Wayne Barrett's books. The facts were in front of us the whole time, if we only bothered to look for them. Now, moments of crisis were made for these sociopathic authoritarian types to swoop in and take the lead and take charge. I mean, history literally shows us this. But especially if they have good political instincts. And in case of Governor Cuomo, can add a little staged humility and self-deprecating humor to soften the pain of the sharp knives stabbing you repeatedly in the back. Now, if you aren't aware of Andrew Cuomo's sociopathy, let me remind you of a few of his greatest hits. Andrew Cuomo is bad with women. When facing questions about not protecting women who experienced sexual harassment or assault in New York State government, a well-respected female reporter was told by him that you don't understand and you do a disservice to all women. And this was all happening while his puppets in the IDC blocked codifying Roe v. Wade in New York State, angering most feminists and women's groups. Have you heard about the IDC? Do you know what this is? So it was one of Cuomo's brilliant Clintonian triangulation schemes. The IDC, the Independent Democratic Conference, was a group of 8 state senators elected in Democratic districts who then went to Albany and literally caucused with the Republicans, voting with them in exchange for financial perks, leadership positions, and, of course, bigger offices. So how did that affect New York? Well, instead of being a totally Democratic state, we had a Republican state Senate that blocked anything that leaned to the left of Pat Buchanan because of the IDC. And then Cuomo didn't have to look bad. He could continue to claim to be a progressive, not getting caught vetoing bills like codifying Roe v. Wade or protecting undocumented immigrants or the New York Health Act or voting reforms, criminal justice reform, or campaign finance reform, just to name a few. The IDC was his foil, designed by Cuomo to make him look like the good guy so he could someday claim to be progressive while running for president in the Democratic primary. But in the era of Donald Trump, New Yorkers woke up. They weren't buying it and organized. And almost all the IDC members were voted out by their activist-backed challengers in 2018. The IDC died, and the state Senate is now in control of Cuomo's Democratic enemies. Seriously, his own party members are his worst enemies in the state that he represents that's Democratic. Now, Cuomo also claims to have passed sweeping progressive legislation like free college or the SAFE Act, which is gun reform, both of which are extremely watered down. In the case of free college, even Senator Bernie Sanders himself was convinced, appearing on camera with Cuomo in support when it was passed. The free college program applies to a small percentage of New Yorkers who have to qualify and follow strict guidelines even after graduating, or they face the risk of losing that funding and having to pay for school years later. Cuomo took triangulation to another level, finding the most creative ways to appear to be progressive while taking the same real estate developer and charter school money that the New York Republicans and their IDC cronies took. But wait, there's more. During Governor Cuomo's first successful campaign for governor, he also ran in 2000 before he was attorney general, and he lost. So when he ran for his first successful campaign for governor, he ran in the midst of a massive corruption sweep in New York state government. So he famously campaigned against corruption, and once he took office, he established the Moreland Commission to investigate public corruption. But then, poof, magically, the commission was abruptly shut down in the midst of many investigations, one which landed right in his executive office. What was the result? Even after the Moreland Commission was shut down, U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara continued many of the investigations, including investigating the Buffalo billion-dollar scheme that led to his closest senior advisor and claimed other brother, Joe Percoco, to prison for corruption, coming out of his office, Governor Cuomo's office. Now, just yesterday, Cuomo moved the presidential primary to June to coincide with the congressional primary. When I was on the Unity Reform Commission, the DNC Unity Reform Commission, we unanimously advised all the primary deadlines and dates in New York to be consolidated. It had the most complicated system in the country, and we advised that they become uncomplicated so people knew how to vote and when to vote and how to register. But some of this had to be decided by the party, the Democratic Party that Governor Cuomo undemocratically runs. In New York, which has the second lowest voter turnout in the country, despite being a Democratic state, just above Republican Louisiana. In New York, the state Democratic Party is controlled by Governor Cuomo, and they were refusing electoral reforms that would grow the party. The governor has used his slate appointments through his appointed party leadership to control the party rules and access. It is not a party easy for progressives to take over when the rules are written to keep them out. Does that sound familiar? Which brings me to today. While Governor Cuomo is busy charming Jezebel writers and exhausted moms during his daily press conferences, behind the scenes, when the cameras are off, the lights are off, he is actually pushing for austerity through Medicaid cuts. For real. He is refusing to accept $6.7 billion in federal funding to help New Yorkers in a time of crisis because he wants to slice up and tinker with Medicaid. He wants to slice up Medicaid to fit his fiscal budget. You know, instead of taxing the 0.1% in New York, he would rather cut Medicaid while thousands of New Yorkers are dying and being hospitalized during COVID. He would rather reward his cronies while we are all distracted with our own personal crises and health and entertained by his squabbles with Trump and his nightly mama's boy shtick with his brother on CNN. Sociopathic. Let me tell you, dating a mama's boy type, it might be fun for a minute when you don't know better, but you never want to marry one. Andrew Cuomo is not our friend, and he sure as hell should not be president. Cuomo, even in a time of crisis, is willing to find ways to protect the biggest corporations and wealthiest people in New York at the expense of sick and hurting New Yorkers. He would sell New York City to another country if it meant he could balance his budget. Remember that the next time he's making a joke about his latest fishing trip with his brother. Our first guest is the author of Rat Fucked. You may have read it a few years ago. He is one of the nation's experts on gerrymandering, and his most recent book is called Unrigged: How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. It is David Daley. Thank you so much for joining us virtually, as we all are right now in this new era. So last time we tuned in was a couple years ago. I was on my SiriusXM show, and you were talking about the gerrymandering of America. And it doesn't seem like, despite 2018 wins and winning back the House, it doesn't seem like it's getting much better. Where are we right now in the state of democracy in America, David?
The state of democracy in America is dire, but citizens are determined to improve it. I mean, let me start with the dire news first. There are 59 million Americans who live in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature are controlled by the party that won fewer votes in 2018. 59 million of us, that's almost 1 in 5. And if you want to think about the partisanship of that, all 59 million of those people live in states where Democratic candidates got more statewide votes. Republicans still hold all of the power in those chambers. So the lines that were drawn by Republicans in 2011 continue to hold up. They continue to define the state of play in state legislatures and also in Congress. Democrats managed to take back the House in 2018. They pulled an inside straight in the handful of competitive districts that were left. And they were helped out by the fact that courts overturned some of the worst Republican gerrymanders in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, and in Florida, resulting in new maps in some of those states in the middle of the decade. The good news is that Americans have had it with this. Red states blue states, purple states, all Americans hate gerrymandering. They know that it's cheating. In 2018, you had 5 states, and these are some unpredictable states. They are Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, Colorado, and Utah that passed ballot initiatives creating independent commissions or trying to take the power to draw district lines away from politicians. So that is pretty amazing news. With the exception of Utah, where it was close, all of the other ones won with 60, 70% of the vote. So that's red states, it's blue states, it's Democrats, Republicans, independents. It's really hard to get 60% or 70% of the vote for anything these days. But regular Americans understand that this is bad, that it's wrong, that it's pushed our democracy to the extremes, that it's polarized us, that it's created gridlock and dysfunction, and they want it stopped.
I mean, it is such sophisticated electioneering. I mean, in your previous book, you talk a lot about this, but when did this new type of electioneering that sort of, I mean, I guess this is my editorializing, but it seems like it's going against the demographic shifts. It's electioneering for a few that really don't represent what America looks like today, maybe a little bit what it looked like 30, 40, 50 years ago. Is that correct?
I think that's exactly right, and I think that's intentional. Republicans hit on this strategy of using redistricting as a path back to power after the 2008 election. So 2008 brings Barack Obama, and it brings a Democratic supermajority to the U.S. Senate, right? 60 seats. That's really hard to imagine now. Also a renewed majority in the U.S. House. And Republicans looked around that night and they said, boy, the demographics in this nation are changing. What are we going to do? And a handful of strategists ahead of 2010, they realized, oh, wait a second. 2010 is a redistricting year. It's a census year. We're going to redraw all these maps in 2011. We could control that entire process if we spend, a few $1 million trying to win key state legislative races in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio, Michigan, Florida. And they pull this off. 2010 is a good Republican year, but it was also a strategic Republican year because they focused down ballot in these key states. They flipped all of these legislatures, and they haven't flipped back ever since because Republicans were aided by the amazing new technology. Gerrymandering's been with us for a long, long time. It's the oldest political trick in the book in many ways. But the gerrymandering that gets done in 2011 is more technological than ever before. It's more precise and surgical. The big data that's available on us all is just so voluminous. They're able to go up and down the street and create exactly the districts that they want and create maps that give them power for a decade.
Okay, so we're in a census year right now, in the midst of this crazy moment where who knows how accurate the census figures are going to be reflective of society. It's already difficult enough, and add in the layer of everybody's stuck at home and unable, just worrying about whether or not they're going to survive the next, few weeks, months, economically or health-wise. So prior to this crisis, where did you think, when you were writing this book, where did you think this year was going, what was going to look like after this year's census with the Republicans and the Democrats? Strategically.
I think there's good news and bad news, right? The good news is that the Democrats are very well aware of the importance of 2020 this time in a way that they fell asleep in 2010 and didn't even realize this. I talk with Eric Holder in the book, who's really heading up the Democratic redistricting efforts ahead of the next census year. And he says, we had never heard of these Republican plans. And he told me a story about being in the Oval Office with Obama after the 2012 election and looking at the numbers and and the two of them saying, we did pretty well. How come we didn't win any of these states or more seats in Congress? They had no idea what had happened. They're pretty fully woke now, So they're out there and they're trying to make progress. The challenge is that it's really uphill because you've got to take back some of these state legislatures, and the state legislatures have got these tilted maps. So you've got to win on these maps. Democrats have not been able to do that in any of these states this decade. So 2020 is going to be all important. The good news out of Michigan, for example, is citizens stepped up and won an independent redistricting commission there. So citizens did what politicians could not, and things will be better in Michigan. In Virginia, another citizen group demanded essentially that the state legislature fix a redistricting. It will be a slightly fairer process there. In Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court has stepped in. It's going to be fairer there. But in a state like Wisconsin, for example, it's really hard to see a road back. I mean, in 2018, Democrats kick out Scott Walker of the governor's office. They re-elect Tammy Baldwin to the Senate. They elect Democrats to every single statewide office in Wisconsin, and they favor Democratic Assembly candidates by 200,000 votes. And Republicans still hold a 63-36 edge in that chamber. So it is really, really uphill. The Supreme Court is not going to be anybody's judicial superhero. Citizens are going to have to do that for themselves. But the amazing thing I saw when I was out reporting this book was just how intent citizens are on fighting these fights and how they can win them even in
Let's talk a little bit about these independent commissions, because I think unless citizens are informed about it, they really don't understand the difference between that and the status quo in their state. So what does an independent commission look like, and why do we trust them over the current system in a state?
Because the current system in these states involves politicians drawing their own lines, choosing their own voters. It's the ultimate fox guarding the henhouse. It's a complete conflict of interest, and it shouldn't be allowed. No other country in the world allows politicians to do it. It's better when citizens, when non-partial people step back and have that role. And we've seen it work in states around the country. California is the best example. They've got a citizen commission. I believe it's 15 people, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 5 independents. They hold public meetings. They draw all the maps in public. So it's all completely transparent. It's not behind closed doors like it is when the politicians do it. And they have to come to consensus on the map. So they have to think about communities of interest. They have to hold counties together. And then most of these commissions require supermajorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents to approve a map. So you can't simply have 2 groups team up together and cram the maps down the other side. It doesn't work that way. So in many ways, it mirrors the kind of politics we would like to see, right? I mean, imagine if everybody had to actually get in a room and talk together and work out their problems and try to solve them. And it's worked really, really well in California. And a lot of these new commissions that passed in 2018 are modeled on that.
Mm. So looking at the map right now and states that could potentially be a little bit more fair, I mean, can you just name some of the states that could potentially have an independent commission or in the next election cycle could balance out a little bit more based on just demographic shifts, even with gerrymandering, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't think we've seen a lot of huge demographic shifts over this decade that are going to affect 2020 the way Democrats might prefer. North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, all of those states, Democrats continue to win. I would keep my eye on Arizona, and I'd keep my eye on Texas. I think both of those are nearing a tipping point. I don't see it coming in 2020. The other danger here, and I don't want to get too far down in the weeds, but I think this is something that people ought to be aware of and starting to think about, which is that while Democrats have caught up to the Republican strategy from 2010, Republicans are going to have a new strategy in 2020. They're not just standing.
Right.
They don't ever do that, right? I mean, when you are losing the demographic war, you have to win the creativity war when it comes to suppressing the vote and putting up barriers. So what that they are going to try to do, and I've heard the tapes of their secret meetings at ALEC conferences in which they tell Republican legislators that what they need to do in 2021 is to not draw districts based on total population, on everybody, but to draw them only based on citizen voting age population.
Right.
Above the age of 18, which means a whiter, older, more rural, and more conservative group. And that's got the power to roll back about 20 years of demographic change across states like Georgia, Texas, Florida, Arizona. So the Democrats in state legislatures have got to be on the lookout for this. It sounds wonky, it sounds boring, but it could redefine our politics.
Because you have immigrants coming in and their children are citizens, but the parents may not be able to vote, especially if they're the children of undocumented. And in states like Arizona, that's enough to change the makeup of the legislature.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right.
Wow. So I would be a bad DNC exposer, I guess that's the term, if I didn't bring up the point that, Barack Obama did sort of fall asleep at the wheel when it came to state legislatures, and the DNC, notably after he became president and the head of the DNC, the figurehead, the money really went straight towards the presidential races, and they pulled money from state parties, which were essentially there to boost local electeds and local lawmakers and build the party apparatus, which of course helps when you're fighting at the legislative level. So, one of the complaints that I've heard from when I was covering the DNC chair race and beyond is that, great, Eric Holder started this organization with President Obama, but, why didn't you fund the mechanism within the DNC that funds the state parties? Why didn't you fund that group? And there's some friction there. I mean, did you have any of those conversations with Eric Holder or anybody else who may have any knowledge of it?
Yeah, I think that they, the DNC, I think, is a kind of organization that tries to keep its power very close, right? We saw that this year when they tried to, create a blacklist and cut off anybody, any consultants or pollsters who wanted to work with primary challengers. They fell asleep at the wheel in 2010. And the consequences for that have been, deadly for our politics. It's meant a decade of conservative dominance in state legislatures around the country. It's meant that, the Democratic bench has atrophied in all of these states. It's led to policy in a lot of these places that is just so far right, even in states like North Carolina and Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, even in purplish states. So there's a lot of blame to be handed out. I think that they're aware of the problem. I'm not always sure that they're doing what needs to be done to fix it. What I've been excited by is seeing so many new groups that have come forth determined to sort of rebuild the party at the ground up. And I do a chapter in the new book on them, on Run for Something and Flippable and Sister District and Forward Majority, and sort of all of these groups that sort of understand that state legislatures are the building blocks of everything. And until Democrats find a way to win these back, and they have to win them back everywhere, not just in blue states. They have to find a way to win them back in Georgia and in Arizona, places where, Democrats haven't won in the last decade. It's really, really hard to do. These groups, I think, have a new awareness of the problem, and they've been taking it on with some success. It seems to me that the success the Democrats had in winning back seats in Virginia and winning back seats in New York State, some in Florida, have really been due to these new groups and kind of the new progressive energy at that level.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a New York resident who happens to be in Arizona right now, but I was very involved really early on with the Take Back, the IDC level, the challenge to the Independent Democratic Conference, which was, just as a reminder to anybody who isn't aware, there were 8 Democrats who were in Democratic districts that were literally conferencing and caucusing with Republicans, holding up the state Senate in New York State, which should really be an entirely Democratic state. The voters elected Democrats. And on the topic of this show, which we start off talking about Andrew Cuomo, it was by the design of Andrew Cuomo. Blake Zeff was one of the reporters who early, touched on this early. And, we might be loving him right now, but let's not forget that IDC held up quite a bit of pretty mainstream Democratic legislation, like, solidifying a woman's right to choose, for instance, in New York State, and much, much more, like the New York Health Act and protecting immigrants. Just there's a long list of issues. So, it was amazing to see these groups pop up after 2016, and not just progressives. I mean, that's what I think was really interesting, is it was this coalition between people that voted for Hillary Clinton, that worked on Hillary Clinton's staff, rising up and running for state Senate as challengers to Democrats. I mean, that was kind of unheard of unless you were a far leftist for many, many years. So there's some hope there. But, bringing it back to what you're saying, the Eric Holder organization, I think a lot of people fear that, okay, this is just another organization that a bunch of consultants are going to make a lot of money on.
I followed Holder out to Ohio, where he was involved in the state auditor race. And that's a really important race for redistricting out there. Nobody knows it, right? It's a state auditor, but that office holds a seat on the statewide commission. I followed him out to Wisconsin, where he was involved in Supreme Court races, because that's the only way for Democrats to win back any levers of power there, is to try to do it in the courts. So I do think that they're strategic and sort of focused on the underballot in creative and smart ways, but they've got a lot of making up to do for what went down 10 years ago.
Well, I'm probably going to have to call you again soon, because we have no idea how this census is going to play out. Do you have a sense? I mean, are you reading anything about the effects of this crisis in the census reporting?
I think it's too soon to tell. It's certainly going to be hard for people to go out and do the kind of door-to-door census work. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, everybody's at home, right? I mean, I filled mine out already. Perhaps there will be a bigger early jump on census reporting than there would have been otherwise. I think a lot of those envelopes hit our mailboxes just as we all started social isolation.
Yeah, exactly. And, we often forget about the people who don't have access to broadband, who are in rural communities, and how that's going to affect the census numbers in the end. David, super interesting conversation. We can't take our eyes off of this stuff, in the midst of a crisis. Sometimes it's by design, sometimes it's by accident, but the people who are in power definitely benefit when we're not paying attention to the details like this in the process. So I really appreciate you for always focusing on it, and I would love for you to write a book on the Democratic Party at some point. I mean, I'm just going to throw that out there.
I think that there's a lot there. This new book has a lot of hope and optimism in it. It's a lot of stories of people stepping up and fighting back and winning in unlikely places, and I think we could all use some hope and optimism right now.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope you can get some writing done while you're quarantined, because that's I was reading some history. Like, a lot of amazing things happen throughout history through past quarantines. So, maybe some good stuff will come out of this too.
Silver lining, my friend. Thanks again.
Thanks, David. You're watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. If you're not already, please click subscribe and that little bell button to get alerts on our upcoming shows, our live streams, and interviews. And if you are not already, please join us on Patreon, because in times like this, independent media is always under attack. and we are compiled basically of small dollar contributions to fund this show, to fund our producer Dorsey, who's been doing incredible work back in New York, and to build this little studio that's coming together. So you can go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. Anything you can at this moment is we're just so grateful for. And if you can't, please give us an email. We'll figure something out. thenomikishow@gmail.com. Our next guest probably doesn't need an introduction. He is the host of The Rational National. We're talking to David Doel, remotely, of course, but that's what we do either way. So, we're professionals at this point. All you newbies figuring this out.
Yeah, I mean, even if this wasn't going on, we'd still be doing it remotely. As you know, I'm in Canada. I'm nice and safe here in my little bunker. So, but this is how it is.
It is. It's the new norm. So, David, I watch your show, and I've been on your show, which thank you so much for having me on in the past. But I find it so interesting that you're a host in Canada, and you're so spot on about American politics. And I feel like I'm always having to, and everybody pays attention to American politics because it just has such an impact on the world, unfortunately, in many ways. But when did your deep interest in U.S. politics start?
It really started with Jon Stewart, basically. I mean, I wasn't even really into politics until my early 20s. I was in school for business. I really had no idea what I wanted to do as a teenager. So I went to school for business, ended up working for a year, then going back to school for video production. And then during that process, I started watching Jon Stewart, Colbert, eventually the Young Turks. And that kind of piqued my interest more in politics in general and American politics. And of course, as you say, the impact that the U.S. has on the rest of the world. And that's kind of where my interest began. And then at some point along the line, I ran as a Green Party candidate in Canada. That was in 2015. And actually, that was inspired by Bernie Sanders. So seeing him and what he was fighting for, and seeing that I could actually, even though I knew I wasn't going to win because Green Party, there's I think 3 seats the Green Party has in Canada. I wanted to be able to have a platform and get this message out there. And then once that happened, and I had my run, I launched the channel and began to focus on the American election back in 2016, and that's kind of where this all began.
It's pretty impressive, actually. So you were inspired by Bernie Sanders. Had he already announced his run for president in 2015, or was this prior?
He had already announced. So he announced in I guess in May or June, and then I ran as a Green Party candidate starting in August of that year, so a couple months after. And he's kind of what inspired me in that run.
You were an early Bernie supporter.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, early as 2015, I guess is early. But considering he's been around for 40 years, I feel like I wish I knew about him earlier, because this is a man who, I mean, at this point, he's my hero. This is a guy who's just been on message, has been fighting for people, for poor and working class his entire career, has never gotten the recognition for it until recently. Yeah. And it shows you the character he has that very few politicians do, which is why I called it again and again. I said he is a once in a lifetime candidate. You do not have people like this come along very often with this kind of track record of actually fighting for people and being able to run for president and potentially become president. So he still is a once in a lifetime candidate. And I mean, the chances are slim at this point, but who knows? He would be a game changer.
Listen, the chances were slim for Joe Biden a month ago. Granted, he controls the operation, and it's much easier when the media is on your side and money's on your side, rules are on your side, and the Republicans seem to be on your side too. So we've got a little bit more of an uphill battle. Yeah, it's unfortunate. So we're sitting here in this crisis. Nobody, you can even write this crisis. People who write sci-fi have written about plagues and pandemics, but I don't think anybody could have anticipated something like this in an already crazy election year with a president who's out of his freaking mind, and everybody, income inequality larger than it's been, prior to this economic crisis that we're now facing. Prior to that, it was the worst income inequality we've had since 1929. So you already have a country that's just going through so much, and then we're handed a pandemic. The world was handed a pandemic, and now we are about to face what's likely to be a global depression. No bailouts for one country or another. We're all in this together. The entire workforce, with exception to people who are on the front lines, are forced to work from home if they can work from home. I mean, we're facing unprecedented times, and my friends have been talking about how they're watching cable news more, but they're also plugging in online and watching shows like ours. And I think there's something very special about being able to work in this environment. Granted, we are not, as independent media hosts, we're not taking big corporate checks, and we're not having like the governor of New York on to talk about our moms. Governor Cuomo. It's like Governor Cuomo's comedy hour every night on CNN. In fact, I would say please unplug from that and plug into us. But it does feel like this is a moment for us too to rise to the occasion and be there for the greater progressive universe and people who are at home watching YouTube more often. And I mean, you feeling there's a little bit of a shift in your show since COVID?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, this is a time where in many ways we are sort of lucky because we are able to still work because a lot of our work is simply online. So you can work from home and still do your show, whatever it is. And you're seeing a lot of people do that now. And the show is definitely I got to say, the first week where this really hit me, I had a really hard time doing my show because it was so depressing. My show generally, I try to be a little more optimistic, a little more uplifting. Politics can be kind of a thing that brings people down. So I try to take a more optimistic tune when it comes to my takes. So this crisis definitely hit me in a negative way for about a week. But it reminds me in a way when Trump won, where when it first hit, you're just like, what? Like, how do you process this? And then you eventually realize you're in it now, and now it just becomes the new normal. And right now, this is really the last half of this week for me is me realizing this is the new normal. And I'm not even really like thinking about the situation we are in as much as I am thinking about how do we get out of this and how best can I inform people on what is going on while still keeping people's spirits up, as I try to do during, as much as it is possible to do that during this crisis. But it's definitely taken a different tone. Every single story somehow relates back to COVID. I mean, how does it not at this point, whether it's you're talking about the primary, talking about the election. Trump just recently wanted to put troops on the Canadian border. Like stories like this, where a story like that, I can cover it and laugh because of how crazy it is. So there are still moments where you can make people laugh and hopefully enjoy the content while still learning about what's going on. But it's definitely it's a moment for independent media to really shine. And I got to say, at the same time, we got competition when it comes to cable news, when it comes to network news. A lot of people now are tuning in to cable news in ways they haven't before because they want to know what's going on. And I totally understand it. I mean, it's the thing that network and cable news has that we don't is a direct line to the government. So they are able to get the direct word out on what is happening. But at the same time, I think independent media, we have a better way of analyzing what is going on compared to what cable news does. So I think I understand people wanting to go to cable news for just the straight facts. But if you want better analysis on how to deal with this and what is actually going on, then I think that's where you come to independent media.
That's a great point because, the other day I've been watching CNN. I'm just as guilty. It's on. I'm watching the press conferences and Dr. Fauci, of course, everybody loves Dr. Fauci. But it flipped a couple of days ago to a political panel. And I was like, turn it off now. I can't. It was like David Axelrod's analysis of how COVID is going to influence the election. Get off.
Yeah, the analysis is it's so archaic. Like that, it has not evolved. And now, in some ways, they've had on CNN has brought on Alexandra Rojas. Though I'm not sure if she's been on recently, but she was on a little more, at least last month, while it appeared Bernie was potentially going to win the nomination. They've had on Abdul El-Sayed. So they bring on people that are more progressive, more Bernie supporters. But for the most part, it's David Axelrod and Dana Bash and people saying, "Oh, Trump struck the right tone today." And it's just like they're completely missing the point of like what is actually going on, focusing on Trump's tone and completely ignoring, the lack of testing or just the fact that people aren't getting enough money into their hands to be able to deal with this crisis. So I think I have to imagine a lot of people at home are, if they turn on CNN and they see David Axelrod making, comments about the election that are just not what people are feeling at home, people are going to go elsewhere or look elsewhere for some other sort of analysis. And I think that's where they can find YouTube and find us.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting because I didn't really think about it until now that, when they put so much energy into their political roundtables, and I guess it was for ratings, or they thought it was for ratings, and maybe it did work for ratings because now everybody's home and we need straight facts, so their ratings are up because of two things: there's a crisis and people are home. But Jeff Zucker notably set up those roundtables so that they were like shouting matches. I mean, I was there in 2016. When you had people like Scotty Nels Hughes and me, on a panel arguing like at the top of our lungs, and it was, I mean, that was his design. That's what he's talked about. And now I think it doesn't fit the moment, but it's also people are really tired of it, and there are alternatives where it's a little bit more thoughtful, at least for folks under 50. I mean, we know where the voting trends go, and it lines up with the cable news trends as well, which is crazy.
People want deeper analysis. Like the shouting matches make sense if you're looking for entertainment and you just want to be entertained. But now people are looking for information, and they're wondering what is going on, and they're wondering why the government isn't doing enough and what is happening and who is fighting for them. And you see a moment like Bernie Sanders last night on the Senate floor fighting for poor and working class people. That's what they want out of their politicians. They want to see that their politicians, their representatives, are as angry as they are. And very few politicians bring that. Very, very few political analysis on CNN or cable news brings that. So they're going to find that kind of analysis, that kind of anger in independent media. So yeah, CNN at this point is just like, I get the straight news and getting the facts, but when it comes to analysis, you're not going to find the right analysis on cable news.
Yeah, I mean, they happen to have seats in the White House press room, and that's what they get. And they get press releases from the White House, and they get press releases from the CDC. But for the most part, I mean, you can go to New York Times, you could go to any, Washington Post. They all, of course, their political sides all have a bent. But when it comes to just the straight facts about the crisis, you can go there as well, and we can interpret it for the audience. Let's talk a little bit, can we pull back the curtain for the audience a little bit? Because I think people wonder, how does this all work? Anytime I take a background shot when I'm on set with Sam Cedar, I can't believe how many people are like, wow, that's what it looks like? Like, this is how you guys do it? Wow. So you've been doing this for a few years now, and you've built up quite an audience. You're at the top of my feed on YouTube every time I sign in. And, this has been but you've been pretty focused and diligent about your effort. What has it been like for you to build this channel out and to see your voice grow in a movement and be looked at as a voice of reason, as a voice of authority?
It's funny because I don't really process it or think about it in a weird way. Like, I started doing this work because I wanted to get my voice out there in terms of my analysis, and I wanted people to look at issues differently in a way they maybe didn't think of before. And actually, when I started, I was doing a lot more comedy, so it was I was trying to do more of like a comedic take on news that eventually evolved into what I'm doing now. But for me, it's I take it day by day. So I focus less on sort of how the audience. I mean, obviously, I notice the audience has grown, and that's awesome. And it still bothers me when I know YouTube is suppressing all of our voices compared to what they were doing back in 2015 and earlier.
Let's go back to that in a second. I'm very curious about that, but go ahead, keep going.
Oh yeah. So yeah, at this point, I just take it day by day, and I enjoy what I do. As long as I find the right story I want to focus on, that's kind of my focus. It's less about how the audience has grown, but it is awesome to see that there is an audience for this content, and that that people do come to me to get their analysis.
And it's a lot of work. I mean, I think people aren't really aware of how much goes into putting on a show. You're not just staring into a camera. You've built a studio in your house, and you're combing through clips all day and news stories. I mean, how much of your day is dedicated to this?
It's all day. I mean, even when I'm not shooting or researching, I'm watching other people's shows, and I'm like watching your show or watching Sam Cedar or watching TYT, watching Kyle Kalinske. Like I'm getting different opinions, and just to see what other people are saying as well and getting their analysis. So it really it's kind of a full day job. I'm awake. I wake up. I'm on Twitter, seeing what the big stories are. And yeah, as you say, it's every. I'm involved in every aspect of it. So whether it's finding the stories that I want to cover, researching into that story, looking deep into their sources and what I'm reading, and then get to shooting it or getting my points down, shoot the video, edit it, post it, the whole thing, like social media. And then, while this is all happening, I have Twitter on in the background. Sometimes I'll have cable news or some other show on in the background, just so I make sure I'm absorbing as much as I can. To give the best analysis possible to my audience. So it's a full-time job and then some, for sure.
Definitely. Okay, so tell me about this YouTube thing, because I'm also learning from you. I mean, I know that the numbers have changed a lot in the last few years, but why, how, help like the audience understand why it's so important to click subscribe right now and to share.
And the bell notification as well, the bell icon. So when you post a video, people will actually get notified on their phone if you click the bell. That's a huge part of it too. But yeah, so back in 2016, when after Trump won, and there was the big mainstream media hoopla about fake news, which obviously there's a lot of fake news on YouTube. But because of that, what ended up happening is YouTube then prioritized what they call authoritative news sources, corporate media. So back during the election, back in 2016, 2015. Channels like MSNBC, CNN, Fox News were not getting many views at all. You can go back then; their videos were getting like 1,000 views a video, like at most. And then once YouTube changed the algorithm to focus on these authoritative sources, all of a sudden the views for MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, all these corporate channels just exploded, because every time now somebody searches up, say, Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, they're going to get videos from MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, New York Times, Washington Post, and we're going to be, on page 38. And that's what it is now. So people, like, one of the massive changes I've noticed in the back end is seeing how people find my videos. In the past, it used to be through the search function and used to be through their videos popping up on other people's channels. So, when you finish watching a video, YouTube will autoplay the next video. That back in the day, 4 years ago, somebody may watch a TYT video, and then the next video that plays maybe my video. Now, if you're watching one of my videos or you're watching a TYT video, the next video that comes up is going to be one of these authoritative sources. So it may be a CNN video, maybe an MSNBC video, or it may just be like even an official Bernie Sanders clip. So they'll also prop up the politicians and their official channels. But when it comes to independent news sources, we are pushed down. Like to be able to find us at this point, it's all word of mouth. Like you have to, I have to have you on my show to tell people to subscribe to you so they'll find you. Otherwise, they're not going to find you when they go to YouTube and search for a certain topic. Unless they're typing in your name, they're not going to find you. So it's YouTube's algorithm has completely focused now 100% on corporate sources.
Is there, there's Patreon and podcasting and YouTube. Do you see there in the near future being some sort of other entity that kind of compiles the left? Is it possible in this day and age? Are we just too monopolistic?
It's tough because one of the big advantages of YouTube is that you can, at least we were able to get people that were watching other content. So maybe somebody's watching, a pop culture video, but we would still be recommended in their feed. And now maybe this person that used to just be into pop culture is now into politics because we came up one time. That isn't happening anymore. Or at the very least, it's happening a lot less than it used to happen. So it is harder for us to grow our audiences now. But yeah, in terms of being able to actually get our voice out there, we just have to kind of help each other out. And Twitch is also a platform that's pretty solid now. It's growing for a lot of people that want us to stream their content as opposed to actually posting videos. You have people up there like Hassan, who does politics, the Serfs, other people on there doing political stuff. So there is left-wing media sort of all over the place. in terms of YouTube, even like TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, I guess somewhat. You can kind of stream on Twitter. But it is hard to bring it all into one and have people understand, okay, here are all the channels that are great. You can see all these channels because there's a lot of us now and we're sort of all over the place. So there really isn't a way at this point to compile it all. But hopefully maybe at some point, I think it does make sense to kind of, I don't know, have some sort of, whether like a platform or just like a website showing people, hey, these are a bunch of different, progressive or left-wing channels that you can check out that maybe you haven't seen before. But at this point, it doesn't exist.
I think a great way for us to break through the algorithm is to do all these things at once. A makeup tutorial, unboxing, is that what it's called? And then like playing with little toys, like the little kids' toys. And then in between all that, we just do our political analysis. Like, did you hear what Governor Cuomo did today?
Yeah, while doing your makeup or something. That's actually, you know what? That's actually a brilliant idea. But like, that's also kind of what happened with Twitch. People, were gaming and then began talking about politics. So you have people on there that are, I mean, I do this now occasionally as well. I have a Twitch account as well where I'll game and I'll talk about politics while I'm gaming. Now, not everybody's into it, especially I feel like the YouTube audience is definitely separate for the most part from the Twitch audience. There are definitely two kinds of audiences, but you do kind of have to get people where they're at. So if they're into makeup tutorials or they're into unboxing videos or they're into video games, if you get them that way, then you can get them in potentially into politics. But because our channels are still categorized as news and politics on YouTube, ultimately we're not going to be ever as as respected maybe as like the dedicated makeup tutorial page or anything. But that actually is, I hadn't thought about that before. If there was a way to sort of compile or get different audiences into politics, that would be at least one way to try and do it.
I mean, isn't that sort of what PewDiePie did? It was like the stupid game, I don't even know. It was like the kids, and then it's like a little Nazi too. It was like Nazi and toys.
Yeah. He's a weird one. I have a really hard time understanding why that stuff became popular. Like I've watched his videos. It just does not appeal to me, but I'm not Gen Z. Clearly he appeals to a different generation than I do, but not even just him. People that even people that game. I love playing video games. I don't get watching other people play video games. I don't understand it. But I feel like I'm just a little too old to understand that really. But it's funny what people find interesting and will begin watching. And if someone on the left can find what that next thing is and incorporate that into their political commentary, they can be big.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe I'll learn how to do makeup first. I'm rationing my makeup right now, so I guess that's not the right option. Let me think about this one for a little bit, because it would have to be very like survivor skills. How about that? That's what I'm going to do. I'm sure that's going to be something people are interested in. I'll come up with ways, recycle your tinfoil and so much more.
Yeah, and then also
with a little bit of politics
as well. I mean, you can talk about how are you surviving during this pandemic, and then just incorporate, Donald Trump into it and turn into a good channel.
Yeah, I'll just take one of my cans of beans that have been sitting there for 30 years and saying, these might be expired, but pick out the bad ones and keep the good ones. Just like you do with your politics. David, thank you so much for taking the time today. Love talking to you as always. And, just keep up the amazing work. Stay safe, stay healthy. How is everything in Toronto right now? I'm not seeing a lot about COVID coming out of Toronto.
We're doing all right. So we're at about 2,000 cases right now, which last I checked, I think the US is around 65,000 cases. So considering we have 1/10 the population, we're actually not too bad, at least compared to the US. But we are pretty much shut down at this point. People are told to stay home. People pretty much are staying home, which is, it's crazy to see just images of cities all completely empty, but it's good that people are social distancing, staying home. And in terms of the government response, Trudeau recently announced that anyone impacted by the virus will be able to receive $2,000 a month for the next 4 months. And that includes if you're staying home to take care of your kids who are out of school as well during this crisis. So it really applies to anybody impacted job-wise by the crisis, which is it's pretty good. $2,000 a month Canadian is about 1,400 American. We're doing some other things as well, like there's a moratorium on student loan payments and on evictions, so people don't have to worry about either of those things as well. So we're doing pretty good. Hopefully, like the thing is, it's so hard to know when this is going to end. People like these countries can do as much as they can, but people have to listen. They have to social distance. They cannot be hanging out with their friends, having parties, or even just going out, or seeing each other for dinner or anything. Like you really have to stay home, stay separated, and just wait this thing out. And the more you do that now, the more you listen now and social distance now, the sooner this will all be over. So hopefully people listen.
That's right. I couldn't agree more. I've had plenty of conversations with loved ones about this, as I'm sure many have at this point. It's like normally they'll say, stop telling me what to do. I'm like, no, this is the time you have to listen to what I tell you to do.
This is the one time you definitely have to listen to the government. This is the time. This is the time to do that.
I know I'm annoying, but stay healthy. We'll talk soon. I really appreciate you and all you do. And if you're not already subscribed to The Rational National, please go subscribe to The Rational National on YouTube and click the little bell icon. There you go, the bell icon. And here too, if you're watching.
Yes, absolutely.
Hopefully you're doing that. Awesome. All right, take care, David.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you to author David Daley and to the host of Rational National, David Doel. And just remember, Cuomo is not your friend. See you next week.